This is a question I get asked a lot during the fit, is people saying, hey, should I, people have always told me I should sort of drop my heel and pull across the bottom of the stroke a little bit and that sort of thing. How should I sort of feel as if I'm pedaling? Should I alter my stroke in some sort of way to make me smoother and more efficient? It's a good question to ask. So everyone assumes a smoother and more rounded pedal stroke means better efficiency and power generation on the bike. So that's a fairly logical statement. It sounds right at first glance, but there's more to it, as we're going to delve into now. So firstly, let's define what smooth means in the context of a pedal stroke. We're talking here about, the best way to describe this is something that A, looks smooth, and that's very hard to define, but you've all seen people with like pros, for example, with what you would call a smooth pedal stroke, and then you've seen people like you with a rocky, choppy pedal stroke. Yeah. You know, there are people with sort of where it just looks effortless.
Yes.
You know? That's what we sort of, that's a very nebulous idea. A better way of thinking about it is to define smoothness if you look at what we would call a torque distribution graph. So if you imagine you're pedaling along and we're looking at one leg at a time here, the downwards force on the pedal can be sort of visualized with a sine wave, a recurring sort of sine wave, right? You start introducing force to the pedal at the peak of the power production, somewhere around the 3 o'clock on that clock of the pedal stroke. It reaches a peak and then it drops away, maybe goes slightly below zero, but usually not. Usually there's still downwards force on the pedal, even at the back end of the stroke on what should be the upstroke. But it goes down to almost zero, and then the next pedal stroke occurs. But if you think of this as a recurring sine wave, is the best way to think about it. A smooth torque distribution is highly indicative of a smooth pedal stroke, in the sense that something which looks really smooth and with a smooth application mathematically will look very nice in person. So these things correlate pretty well. Smoothness looks like a nice steady application of force without a really high peak to it. So a low pedal force effort at the top and quite a wide duration. This person is coming over the top of the stroke and applying force early in the stroke. They're not spiking the load really hard on the downstroke and looking choppy. And then they're applying force quite late through the bottom of the pedal stroke, and maybe even pulling back a little bit if we're really lucky at the bottom of the stroke. So you will see, essentially, with a smooth pedal stroke, you'll see a wider torque distribution with a lower peak, something that looks like this. A choppy pedal stroke will look like the force is applied over a much shorter duration of the crank's rotation, and the peak will be higher. So you get a person that's kind of stabbing at the pedal, and the peak is really high, but it's a really short duration, and there's less pull across the bottom of the stroke. That's how you would describe those two things mathematically, smooth versus not smooth. There is good correlations with the height of that peak and the shortness of the duration of the pedal effort being less efficient. So we want the lower peak pedal effort with the wider duration, because it is a little bit more efficient. It creates less fatigue metabolites through the muscle as you're banging along on your bike. So we want to see that. Now, how do you get that? That's what we're going to try and talk about a little bit later. In the context, let's talk about pelvic rock. Let's talk about pelvic rock now. It is generally speaking true that instability, rocking, and excess movement on the saddle is bad, primarily because of two reasons. One, it creates plane of motion issues with your knees. So your knees will try and move across the line of the pedals as your pelvis moves in a figure eight motion on the bike. And that will then waste pedal effort, which could be going to the pedals. It will splay it off into different areas of your physiology. Your glutes will work too hard trying to control the femur and all this sort of stuff. So rocking is bad further up the kinetic chain because it introduces waste to the system. So stability is a really good thing in the pelvis. So we talked previous at the start of this about like a side-on view of the stroke, but looking at the back of the person and then from the front, rock and excess plane of motion challenges also create an inefficient pedal stroke. So we don't want you rocking too much is a good one. In the context of pedal stroke smoothness as viewed from the side, what we mathematically talked about before, it turns out, and this is where it gets really frustrating, it turns out that from the research that we've done, that pedal stroke technique is generally not a good predictor of performance. So there are people out there, and this is going to circle back around, so try and button this up at the end. It is good to be efficient, but it turns out it doesn't matter that much, which sounds really bizarre. When we analyse the pedal stroke of professional riders, for example, we don't generally see that their pedal stroke is a lot smoother than an amateur. We tend to see higher general pedal effort, so they're pushing down, they're mashing the pedal harder, but we don't actually see that the pro has, generally speaking, across larger sample sizes of people, they don't have a much smoother stroke in general than a poorly or moderately trained amateur, which sounds really, really bizarre, but that is what the research shows us. So what you should take away from that is that the pedal stroke is not generally the limiter for your cardiovascular performance. There are other limiters, which are things like cardiac output, lung perfusion, lung size, hematocrit level, genetics and fitness level. But the pedal stroke technique, if you think, well, you know, am I going to get more power from being smoother? The answer is probably no. You will look better, you will be way less prone to overuse injuries, but will you get more power? Probably not, which is kind of strange. So, you know, a rider, for example, let's talk about a real world example. A rider with a seat that's way too high will have a much spikier, choppier pedal stroke than someone whose seat is at the right height. They will have larger dead spots, that sort of thing. But, you know, when you got to remember when they do the research on this stuff, they're not controlling for the position of the rider. If you put a pro with the smoothest pedal stroke in the world and you raise his seat up 40 millimeters too high, he's going to develop a choppy pedal stroke. So when they're doing the research on this, I always sort of chuckle because obviously what we're alluding to here is the position of the rider is the biggest predictor of pedal smoothness and pedal technique. So things like the cleat position, the arch support, the seat height, the Q factor, these are the things which you can optimize, which make your pedal stroke smoother.
Or their genetics, their symmetry, their general symmetry. That's why the pros look good on the bike, because they're all very symmetrical.
Absolutely.
They don't have the old hip impingements.
Yep, no, because it selects out the less perfect of us, and they never get to that level.
Yeah.
So yeah, you very rarely see a Domenico Pozzovivo, for example, in the pro peloton. They're very rare. You tend to see people who are really neat and symmetrical and stable because it selects out the people that aren't. Yeah. So my experience is that the more perfect the rider's position is in all aspects, the more they do tend to gain on longer efforts. So if you've got a horrifically terrible position, we fix it all up, we make it brilliant, your pedal stroke smooths off, you're getting much better control across the bottom of the stroke and a much lower peak torque effort. You will see some gains in people, but it's generally not 30%. It's, you know, they might pick up a little bit, 5% here and there. At an outlier, maybe 10%, you know, but it's not going to be an enormous thing. And it's generally, unfortunately, probably not going to get you to that world tour level just from having a really good pedaling technique. Yeah. But the position is the big driver of smoothness of the pedal stroke. So if you're having trouble sort of, you know, with a choppy feeling pedal stroke, don't try and sort of drive it by thinking differently about your stroke and controlling it better. It's something in your position. Yeah, that's my job, is to fix those problems. And to circle right back around, you know, if you have to think about the way that you're pedaling and your pedal stroke, it means your position is problematic.
Okay.
Yeah. So you want the subconscious motor control patterns going on at a core level with your motor technique on the bike. You want those as efficient as you can because of injury reduction and maybe a slight gain in efficiency and power if you're really lucky. But you mainly don't want to have to think about it. It means that there's something wrong with your position. If you have to feel like you're pulling across the bottom of the stroke and that sort of stuff, you know, you can forget trying to pull up on the stroke. It doesn't work and it doesn't matter in my experience. And the research tells us this as well. People have this idea that they got to pull up on the stroke, on the upstroke. It doesn't work. Your hip flexor is not well adapted to generating upwards force in a deeply flexed position of the hip. It's gonna hurt you. It's gonna cause problems. So don't pull up, just ride. I always tell my people, or my clients, just ride. Don't think about how it feels. Don't think about altering your stroke if it doesn't feel smooth. think about altering your position in some way, because that is the big driver of pedal stroke smoothness, is the rider's position.
Okay.
So yeah, that's like I warned you at the start, anyone who's here at the end, I warned you there'd be a lot of word salad there.
Yeah.
It's an infinitely nuanced thing, but look, pedal stroke smoothness comes from the position first and foremost. That's the big takeaway here.
Okay.
And the more perfect it is, you might gain a little bit, but you'll certainly have a much lower chance of injury, and you can train harder as well. So there could be power gains to come from that.
Yep.
But don't think about it too much. Just go and ride and let your body and your position interact and do what they do.
Yes, and this is why, Neil, that you've put together an online program called Bike Fit Fundamentals.
Yep.
People want to get their position right fundamentally.
We'll put a link down below. This will guide you through, we're going to do 5, 6, 7 videos on this. Step-by-step instructions for how to nail down the big things in your position, and hopefully help you a lot with your pedal stroke technique by having a really high quality position.
Cool.
No worries at all.
Thank you very much.